We're into the quarterfinals of the Airthings Masters, and I want to take a look at one of the games in the match between Magnus Carlsen and Daniil Dubov. Carlsen won the first game, beautiful rook and pawn endgame. Second game was drawn, and this was game number 3. So Dubov one game down, already having to tread a tightrope. If he lost this game, he would lose that first set. So the game starts out as a kind of semi-Tarrasch. And here, if white wants to play in a very orthodox way, then bishop e2 is the move. Well, as in, for example, Giri against Carlsen earlier this year, which went like this. And generally you get a pretty standard kind of isolated queen-pawn position. But that's okay for black. Carlsen played more ambitiously, pawn to g3. So the bishop comes to this diagonal where it can obviously put more pressure on the pawn on d5. So this is definitely more ambitious. But the downside is it could create weaknesses on the light squares. Knight c6, bishop g2. And here Dubov plays a move which cuts across white's strategy. Pawn to c4, and that also makes sense of this move, pawn to a6. It might, under some circumstances, be possible to create that nice pawn majority, this nice pawn phalanx on the queen side. But you can see that with the bishop on g2 rather than on this diagonal, say e2, then there's less pressure on that pawn on this diagonal. So it makes some sense for black to play like this. And bishop b4. Good development. As we'll see, getting rid of this knight can allow black to play on the light squares. Knight e5. So this kind of tries to cut across black's plans, and well, obviously the exchange here could lead to white winning the pawn. But castles, it's nothing too disastrous for black. Bishop d2 and rook e8, so that forces white to do something about this knight. Do you want to play f4? That's very committal. Then the bishop could certainly come here and possibly into d3 later. Carlsen exchanged on c6. Both players playing very quickly, because in fact Carlsen had exactly this position against Mamedyarov. Now, how would you play here with black? Black to play. Mamedyarov played it differently to Dubov, or Dubov played it differently to Mamedyarov, I should say. Mamedyarov played a5 against Carlsen in Shamkir 2019, and the game did end in a draw. No doubt Magnus would have something prepared there as an improvement, but instead Dubov played in a much more direct way. Very interesting, just giving up that bishop straight away in order to land the knight on the outpost. And supported by the rook, looks pretty good, but you are giving up the two bishops. But then again, with the knight covering that c3 square, well, that's pretty nice in that, you know, that is effectively a passed pawn on c4. So it's a really interesting way of playing, and Carlsen didn't want to retreat the bishop, didn't want to play passively. He played rook c1, covering the bishop, and then a5. So that gives the bishop some room on this diagonal. You can see that black is taking control over these light squares. Pawn takes pawn. Now it's not necessary to recapture with the pawn, but instead bishop a6. That's the point. With a pin. So black is going to recapture the pawn on c4. So for example, if rook e1, then bishop takes c4, and well, you might say that this pawn is backward and a little bit ugly, but it really doesn't matter. It supports the important pawn on d5, which supports that beautiful bishop on c4. And black should be fine in that position. Let's go back. You can see that because white's bishop has come to g2, then that diagonal is a little bit weaker, which Dubov is exploiting. Good strategy. So Carlsen thought, okay, what do I do about that knight? He didn't want to exchange it off. That looks a bit funny when these light squares are compromised. Instead he played f3 to get rid of the knight. Knight takes bishop, rook takes knight, and bishop takes c4. The rook is attacked, and it defended the pawn on a2. So we have actually a very typical position that could arise from many queen's pawn openings, where black has this backward c-pawn, but there's the semi-open e-file with the rook on e8, splendidly placed, and the pawn has advanced to f3, so that pawn is just a little bit weakened. And I would say if anyone is better here, then it has to be black, because, well, obviously with the bishop on c4 there's simply no pressure on c6. There's nothing happening for white on the queen side. Pushing through with e4 looks kind of risky. Black's pieces are very, very active, and it would weaken white's king, and indeed that second rank, because the pawn has advanced from f2, second rank is weaker. Queen g5, excellent move from Dubov, with some pressure on e3. And I think already we can say that the opening has been a success for black. There is no doubt about that. Black simply has the more active pieces. Queen c1. Not that there's any particular danger at the moment, but I think black's moves are very easy to find. Dubov's next move, pawn to h5. Excellent. Gives the king potential escape square, and of course the h-pawn is going to advance and create some pressure against white's kingside. Bishop f1. Well, I think that's a very understandable move. If white's going to get anywhere, then it's important to get rid of that bishop so that he does have some pressure against the c6 pawn. Then again, exchanging those bishops means that white's king is somewhat weaker. Let's see how that plays out. Rook b8. Rook on an open file. Both black's rooks looking really good, protecting each other and very active. And already with the rook on b8, that's just a little reminder that white's king is potentially a bit drafty. Rook takes c6. So Dubov gives up that pawn. But of course e3 is hanging. First of all, before he takes it, he throws in h4. So that's a nice move. Just wants to create a little bit of pressure here. And it certainly doesn't look very good to take that off, which would weaken the king side. So king g2. Played by Carlsen here, keeping everything together. He played that very quickly. If he wanted to cut and run for a draw, maybe this was the moment he could play e4, offering an exchange of queens here. And I would say that black is slightly better in this endgame, but it should be perfectly tenable for white. There's also possibility to just nudge to the side, but I think in this position white should be fine here. There's pressure here, but I think white should be able to hold that. But maybe that's the way. If black wants to keep some pressure on the king, that might be the way to go. In any case, Carlsen played king g2 very quickly. Rook takes pawn. So material is now level again. Carlsen took the opportunity to exchange off that active rook. Good move, rook c8 check. Rook takes rook, queen takes rook, king h7. So the king is pretty safe there. You can see the difference between the two kings. Those 2 pawns on the 7th rank protect black's king, whereas the 2nd rank here basically has to be covered by that rook, so that's not the most active piece. You compare it with black's rook, waiting in the wings, ready to pounce. So it's clear that black has some initiative, black is better here. But still, it's major pieces on the board, and that often gives drawing chances in rook and pawn endgames, for example, even if you're a pawn down. One possibility would be to play queen h3, but then how is this endgame? White's pawn's not very pretty on the king side. Active rook. Some chances to draw, but obviously black is better. Instead, Carlsen played queen d7, keeping an active queen. Fair enough. Still close enough to the king side. Hit some important points in black's position. f6. So just making sure the pawn is protected. It was obviously on prise on f7. Once again, queen h3 is possible, that same endgame. But Carlsen went for queen b5. Queen f5. Okay, pressure mounting. So the queen is now covering the h3 square, ready to advance that pawn again. And then white's king really looks like it could be in a mating net there if the pawn manages to get to h3. Therefore g4. I mean, taking would expose the king. So g4. Now, instead of moving the queen, Dubov flicks in h3 check. Excellent move. If the king goes back, then, well, it's that mating net I was talking about. This is just going to be too strong. The queen comes in to attack. Okay, you can bring the queen back. That's check. King h6. As soon as the rook and queen connect like this, it is absolutely fatal for white. Basically, white cannot protect along the 2nd and the 1st ranks. Black's pieces are simply too powerful, and you can see with that crucial pawn there covering g2, it sets up a kind of mating net. It's really unpleasant. So after h3 check, that's the last move, instead of going backwards, the king has to come forward. Oh, by the way, let's just clear that up. If king takes, rook takes, and mate follows shortly. Let's just see that one. So you can see the king is in a perilous position. King g3. And Dubov creeps forward. Queen e4. Well, they are beautifully centralized, and take care. We haven't got split rooks, but we have split major pieces. That is difficult to compare with black's wonderful major pieces. And here Magnus makes a fatal mistake. It's already quite a difficult position. The queen could come back to d7. If queen f1 might be the best way to try and simplify. Even here, this is a tricky position because somehow the king gets in the way. And, you know, my computer thinks that white is okay here. I'm not going to question that assessment. However, you can see that that is such a difficult position for white to negotiate when, you know, this pawn is coming here. There could be potential to take that one later. The king is still not safe. Major pieces still split. Don't like that. Still difficult to play. And of course, particularly in a rapid play game when you haven't got much time. But Magnus played queen takes pawn, and that queen really is in Siberia. Black to play and win. What are you going to play here? Cheers. Only one move to win. Perhaps Magnus was just expecting queen takes pawn. But instead, f5. And that is fatal. Queen takes pawn, mate. Mate in 1 is threatened. Let's just see that. There you go. Pin and win. So after f5, this pawn has to be taken. And now the king is fatally exposed. So queen b5 was played here. Let's have a look at queen c7, which attempts to bring the queen back to try to defend. But you can see after this move, the king is caught. Rook h6 mate threatened, and if here doesn't make any difference, that queen has gone. After queen takes pawn, Magnus tried queen b5. Rook e6, same story. The rook just coming back to deliver, well, a fatal attack basically. Rook steps aside, rook e2, but rook g6, queen f4, that queen, a very powerful piece. Queen b1, pinning. King h6, steps out of the way, and now look at white's problems. Rook g2 check threatened, queen takes pawn threatened, queen takes d4 threatened. It's just too much. Queen d3, queen takes h2, this is how the game ended. And rook e6, that was the end of the game. Obviously, the king steps back. Well, the simplest way to do it is just to exchange everything on e2, and then the pawn runs home to make a new queen. I really like that game from Dubov. This was a classical attack. It was a classical game. It was about the outpost on e4. It was about the outpost on c4. It was putting your rooks on open files here. About advancing the h-pawn to just chip away at the king. And finally, short of time, Magnus Carlsen made a fatal mistake. Carlsen said afterwards, "I understood that he might have some tricks, but I just stopped calculating." That was very unnecessary. He did well to keep up the pressure. The position was just a draw. He's tough to play because he's so uncompromising. Well, I guess if you look at that and look at it in a higher sense, yes, the white should be okay here. But, well, as Magnus himself said, he did well to keep up the pressure. And when a player is under pressure, they sometimes crack. Even world champions. Dubov said it's very interesting. He's my favourite opponent to face. This match is a gift for me. He's the most interesting opponent. I just like to play the guy. I don't feel any pressure. It's not about the result. People expect exactly nothing, so it doesn't matter how badly you do. I don't need any special motivation. Now that is a fantastic attitude from Dubov, that he relishes playing against Magnus. Of course, they know each other very well because Daniil Dubov was part of Magnus Carlsen's team preparing for the World Championship in 2018. And so I think, Carlsen, well, they both understand each other very, very well. And Dubov, I think, understands how to make life difficult for his opponent. Anyway, that was game 3. Game 4 was a draw, so they ended that first set 2-2. So they will play a second set, of course. And after that, well, if that's still 2-2, they'll go into tie breaks. But anyway, it is even so far. Fascinating chess played, I have to say. Thanks for watching.